there's one other trend that's really positive. I don't know if you call it a trend or a happening that I think has been great, and that's what. And I'm going to say it is kind of the convergence of what we might say, where sort of this continuum of social entrepreneurship to social innovation to social enterprise is kind of the growing of this continuum. That's kind of leading to this notion of convergence, where sort of for-profit, not-for-profit combine in new kinds of organizational structures that are often market-based, right? They're just not responding to sort of optimal profit generation, challenging, a pure for-profit model. So you're seeing that combined with a notion of shared value in the private sector. It's early days, and it was, Porter just named it. I don't think he discovered it necessarily, but Michael Porter, wrote this paper. Yeah, and he had the name that helped, brand it.
And who here,
have you
familiar with the Creating Shared Value article he wrote for HBR 2 years ago?
But I thought what was interesting is a little bit of the typology where you look at, whether it, he talks about 3 areas where shared value is most likely to happen, right? So whether it is reconceiving products and services that can tackle a social issue and a company can make money, or whether it is sort of what you might call, last mile, value chain, connecting global value chains or regional value chains or local value chains to really poor folks, plugging them into that. Or the third is sort of, he talks about cluster and ecosystems, and I think he's weaker on that. But yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, but the conversation is interesting, and because my own organization, looks at that as a tremendous opportunity, and we look at it as an opportunity, for very practical reasons, right? And it's some that you all, would be really aware of. In part, most sort of recovery development work, almost anywhere in the world, this dates me, when I started, in these really tough countries, official development assistance was about 80% of foreign investment and 20% private investment, right? Now it's reversed, almost everywhere, including Somalia, right? It's just reversed. So if you're going to leverage impact, it's going to, you better find ways to plug into that marketplace, because that's where the real resources are, right? And secondly, we know that's more sustainable than other forms of resources. And third, I think because of this notion of convergence, we actually think there's some real power there. There's real potential, some real potential there. So you all tell me when you want to stop, and I can, but I'll give you a couple of examples, drawn from Mercy Corps, and I'd love your thoughts and some of the challenges that we have. So first example is, there's some folks here from Indonesia, right? Yeah, I don't know if if you take microfinance, all of you are familiar with microfinance, and it's been an important tool in the toolkit of development and the toolkit of financial inclusion, right? In terms of reaching certain people. It's been criticized for a number of reasons, but one of the really legitimate points of criticism is that most microfinance, whether you think of Grameen or BRAC, some of these big, groups that came out of Bangladesh, or you think of, it's been retail led. And you haven't had the same architecture ecosystem that characterizes most commercial banking, right? And so if you want to introduce new products and services, it's kind of one institution at a time, right? Not through an ecosystem. Well, Indonesia is one of the world's largest microfinance markets. 50 million people get financial services through, some kind of small, micro or small financial delivery system. 40 million people are still unbanked. You're not going to reach the other 40 million by retail, right? And so what we wanted to test is creating a wholesale bank that's a for-profit, regulated by the Central Bank of Indonesia, which we did with the IFC with other sort of European development investors and some private investors. But the key is building a technology platform that connects, let's say, the 2,000, 2,500 strongest microfinance institutions. So through that technology platform at scale, you can introduce innovative products and services like mobile banking, like micro insurance, like pick your product or service. So that's one, and we treated it. I mean, we were lucky in that we got an initial significant grant from Gates Foundation to support it. They allowed $6 million of their grant to be used as equity. Mercy Corps became the ultimate shareholder with, as I said, IFC, some of the European development finance institutions. I won't name them. Some of you will know what they are, and some private investors, right? But so there, and it's growing. It's attracted much more outside financial capital, more inside. It's still small. It's now like a $300 million bank. It's reaching out to about 5 million end users right now through the network. But the key is that technology platform. Okay, and this is a pure for-profit model of trying to solve an ecosystem challenge with microfinance in one of the world's largest, most dynamic microfinance markets. So that's one example. And ours is, how do you navigate the regulatory environment? How do you really go to scale? How do you get uptake? How do you get a technology system that works? Because now it's past the break-even mark. We did the business plan, treated it. It is, as I said, was losing money on schedule for its first 2 years, and then on schedule it started making money. And the challenge there is the temptations to do the low-hanging fruit to make money get in the way of being more risky around the technology platform and investing in that and the uptake, which is the ultimate home run from a social standpoint, right? So that's one. The second, totally different, but since Ian brought up Haiti, we all know what happened in Haiti a number of years ago with the earthquake. Hopefully an earthquake is a once in a 500-year or longer cycle. But folks in Haiti, and particularly poor folks, storms every year come through and destroy assets, right? And so the question was, how do you bring micro insurance, to folks so that they have, one, that they've got the real comfort to take some risk. They're not going to lose everything if they invest. If they invest in their businesses, or if they invest in expanding agriculture, or if they hire people, that when the storms come through and destroy the crops every year, that there's something they can draw back. And how do you do it in a sustainable way? And so we, with a microfinance institution and Swiss Re, created a microinsurance company, because in Haiti, the regulatory environment hadn't quite evolved. It's getting there, but so we had to set it up in the Caribbean, interestingly enough. And again, set up an interesting facility that allowed outside investors to come into it. And now the challenge is, okay, how do you expand this? And it's paid out now close to $10 million to small borrowers, who take a loan from microfinance institutions. So it's paid out quite a bit. It has attracted outside investment. So with Swiss Re, the challenge is now, can you use this as a model to grow throughout the Caribbean, in Africa, and in Asia? Part of the innovation is not just sort of a last mile solution to bring risk insurance that many people take for granted to poor people, but it is sort of playing with the business model, so where you get a blend of, I don't want to get too technical, of parametric insurance, which means a payout is triggered by a weather event, amount of rainfall, wind speed, not by damages, right? But so everybody, if the threshold is crossed, gets a payout, right? And then, but mixing that with indemnity, which is basically assessment of damages, right? And there's often certain limits on that, but so it's blending it to so you're innovating not only in the partnership and the structure, but you're innovating around the actual product. And so that's where I think it falls into that kind of shared value. For us, and the value was, Swiss Re doesn't know how to work with poor farmers. They have no connection. So we become, and you were talking to one of my colleagues, that last mile, I like to call it the first mile, though, so the first mile. connector. One of the biggest challenges, and this is a question that I think for all of it, is that the so-called last mile, first mile challenge. If you take a company like Unilever, does everyone know Unilever? Sort of one of these big consumer products companies. Yeah, you know everything about Unilever. Okay, so yeah, so Unilever, has got a very enlightened CEO, a strong commitment to want to bring smallholder farmers. They look out. There's, depending on who's counting, there are 500, 600 million smallholder farmers in the world, right? And could we, as a way to boost their incomes, boost their productivity, bring them into these global value chains, right? And so Unilever's very committed, or Pepsi might be very committed, Walmart is very committed. But when you really look at it and analyze it, it's mostly, boutique exercises. There aren't many examples of anyone being successful at scale. And it's because, and this is the real challenge, this is what, if I were in your shoes, I'd be so excited about, because the person who figures out the business model in that last mile, first mile, should win whatever, the Nobel Prize for something. Because that is where it breaks down, right? Is how do you, at scale, right, bring smallholder farmers, for example, we could pick other industries, into global value chains so that their products, they can grow enough. There's a sufficient kind of quality. You can manage the supply chains cost effectively to serve a global marketplace, or a large regional. You don't even have to be a global, a large regional market. But who figures that out, that's going to be potentially powerful. But we think there may have to be a new business model than what has been conceived that can allow that to happen. When I look at the future on the things we have to get right, is, in light of these trends that I talked about, when I started out this morning, that's where I spend a lot of my time, and it really is in 3 or 4 big areas. One is we as an international organization with strong Western roots, we have to figure out how to partner with these new powers, who are increasingly becoming major players in the places that we work. And that's not going to be a tradition. If you look at a lot of the older legacy groups, whether it's Save the Children or Oxfam, or their relationships with other non-Western countries tend to be based around resources they've built. And that's not going to work with China, with Turkey. It's really about partnerships. And so what does that look like? What kinds of partnerships? Which is why I'm excited about an emerging Chinese NGO to be doing joint work. But figuring out going global in this new world is really critical. Secondly, figuring out these diverse revenue streams and business models. So I honestly do think, I don't think we'll be called NGOs in 5 to 10 years. And in part, in many places of the world, NGO has a negative connotation. And also from a lot of the new groups that we really want to hire and partner with. A lot of the social innovation groups look at traditional NGOs as dinosaurs, right? Now I think they're a little bit short-sighted because they've had a hard time moving beyond boutique-y stuff. And traditional NGOs have had a hard time being really innovative. But if you could marry those platforms and experience with a lot of that energy, that just seems like a great partnership waiting to happen. So I'd hope to do some of that. And then the final is the kind of cultural areas of any organization. I think if you get culture right, most everything else follows. So if you can create a culture that attracts great people, that helps them be their best, that celebrates, kind of the right kind of risk-taking and results, is appropriately caring, and is global, right, in its manifestations. Easier said than done, but if you can get that right, I do think that most everything else, will follow, because as you all were saying, what's the most important resource? Well, it's always human capital, right? And if you can get the right people, you'll mostly figure out the right ways forward and the strategies for impact. And I think that's a very important part of, and one of the reasons I travel so much that I think is critically important is I do feel it's really important that I go, to the front lines in some of the toughest places, like, You know, I've been inside Syria and across border and on the, you know, in the really dangerous areas. Not so much so I can add to our strategy, but in large measure to say thank you. Or I go to Helmand, you know, people, you know, as this foreigner running around Helmand in Afghanistan. And in part because I want to say thank you, you know, to the people on the front lines. And I think that's, you know, maybe the most important thing that I do.